While I figure out the logo, then I will turn off the cameras. Not logo-less, yeah.
Hi, everyone. We will wait for a couple of minutes for everyone else to join, and then we will start. All right, we can start. Hi, everyone. I hope everyone is hearing me well, right, Ignacio? Can see you. Second. So my name is Sevda Tunaboylu. I'm a postdoctoral researcher working on Project More. A very interesting discussion is waiting for us today, but before that, a few announcements. So as you may know, the session is being recorded and will later be published in the joint YouTube channel. I take this opportunity to thank Project Miram for organizing the joint webinar series and for their support for us. I will share the link later on to the YouTube channel in the chat. Here you can find the 6 previous sessions on different aspects of irregular migration and return and readmission policies. Also, announcement, the next session will take place on Thursday, June 26, and it will be hosted by Project Prime. I will share again in the chat the link to register later on. This webinar will discuss the rights of irregular migrants in Europe. But coming back to our own session, we will begin with presentations from 3 Horizon projects focused on return and readmission, gaps, fair, and more. Over the past 2 to 3 years, each project has uniquely analyzed public opinion surveys on return and readmission policies. These policies are often justified by claims about public support, yet measuring public opinion in this area is very challenging due to the sensitive and highly politicized nature of the topic. As you listen to the presentations, the audience, please feel free to share any comments or questions in the Q&A box on the top. Our team will then read them out during the Q&A part of the webinar. There are obviously no wrong questions, so don't hesitate to contribute and keep the chat alive. We will now start with the presentation from Project Gaps from Lamis Saleh, and then we will move on to FAIR and more.
Thanks a lot for the nice introduction. You can hear me well?
Yes.
Perfect. I will now share my screen. Yes. So thank you for organizing this webinar. Today I will be presenting to you the part that focuses on the attitudes towards return from the GAPS project. So GAPS basically is the decentering the study of migrant returns and readmission policies in Europe and beyond. And today I will give you a bit of an introduction about our project, a little bit about this work package in specific, some of our hypotheses, the methodology that we follow through our surveys, a glimpse to our results, and then I will conclude. So to start, why gaps? Why are we investigating what we are doing? So as I assume most of the audience are aware that the EU return policies lack a little bit of link between the return and the asylum policies. There's also some lack in the harmonization between the member states, and there is an overlooking of the perspective of the migrants. And here came our project, our Horizon project, to decenter this one-sided understanding of return policymaking by bringing multiple perspectives into play and studying the complex interaction of diverse actors involved in the return process. So the GAPS project is a big consortium. So as you can see, we have partners from many different countries presented in the map. some from countries that receive migrants, some from countries that send migrants, and the project has a lot of work packages that focus on the side of the legal angle of the return, the angle from the returnees themselves, and in this work package that I'm presenting to you today, it's basically on the public attitudes on the return policies using experiments and modeling. So we are basically focusing on the side of the host countries. And the main question covered by this work package is to what extent do public attitudes to migration in Europe are susceptible to change in relation to the success or the failure in the return and readmission policy.
I'm sorry to interrupt. We can hear you, but not very well. Like I'm hearing an echo at least.
Okay, just give
Some
me a
like
second.
buzzing. Yeah.
Okay, let me just maybe. Is it now better?
It's the same kind of.
Oh, okay. Okay, let me stop sharing for a second and disconnect my speakers.
Yes.
Give me a minute.
Sorry for that. It's just because later on in the YouTube channel, if people watches, it's like better to have clear voice.
Is it better now?
Now it's good. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Then back to sharing my screen.
Thank you.
Okay, so where did I stop? Yes. Why is this question important, or why do we need to tackle the attitudes towards return migration in the first place? So this map here shows the numbers of the illegal nationals in Europe, and as you can see, the numbers have been increasing over the years, specifically in Central Europe. And this figure here shows the difference between the numbers of people who were ordered to leave, or like they are supposed to return, that's in purple, and the numbers who actually did leave. And we do see a huge gap, which means that factually there are a lot of numbers of people who are to return, but they are not returning. And we needed to investigate how this affected the public attitudes in those countries in order to be able to provide policy recommendations on how to deal with return migration. So first, before investigating into what we did exactly, we of course started with digging into the literature, into the determinants of the public attitudes towards return migration, and mostly the literature is focused on the determinants of attitudes towards migrants or refugees or asylum seekers in general. However, we found that the attitudes are mainly determined by some personal characteristics of the hosts nations themselves, which are mainly their age, their political ideology, their religion and ethnicity, and also the financial burden that the returnees bring into the country. This is from the side of the host. There are also some other studies that found that there are refugees' characteristics that affects the public attitudes, which are namely the nationality, the gender, the languages, or the comprehending the language of the host country, as well as the jobs or the education of those people. Also the levels of social trust, as well as contact theory, was found to have a huge impact on public attitudes. Gerhard and Dilger focused specifically on attitudes towards return and found that they are mainly determined by the attitudes towards hosting refugees in the first place, the contact theory, the level of education, political ideology, like those two more towards the right, had more negative attitudes, and also the view towards culture and richness, which takes us to our hypothesis, or what we built on our survey on, is that public attitudes is determined by the refugees' characteristics, host citizens' characteristics, the contact theory, and trust levels. So those are the main 4 pillars that we investigated in our survey. What did we do? So basically, we ran our survey in 5 EU countries, which are Germany, Sweden, Netherlands, Greece, and Poland. We aimed to have 1,000 observations per country, and it varied. In some countries we had more, in some countries we had less, but more or less they were around this number. And the survey was composed of 35 questions. We had part of our survey, which I will present to you. The result of it today was our vignette experiment, which basically looked like that. So once the participants agreed to participate in the survey, they were directed to another page, and then they started the survey with this experiment. So they were randomly allocated one of these 4 variations, where we here varied the country of nationality. So basically, whether this person, this returnee was from Syria or Ukraine, the gender, as you can see, a male or a female, the educational background. So either they had a bachelor degree and was working as an engineer, or they had a high school degree and was working as a waiter, and also the level of their language, like they either spoke the language of the country fluently, or they were still learning the language. So this was the first part of the survey, mainly this experiment. And as I mentioned, those were the returnee characteristics that we varied. And we explicitly asked the participants, now you are in the situation of a policymaker, and you are to decide whether this person is to be returned to their country of origin or not, given the sets of varying factors that we would change. So each participant would get 4 variations of those 4 characteristics. The survey then had socio-demographic questions. So ask them about their age, their gender, their political ideology, their religion. We asked them also about their general attitudes towards migration and refugees in the first place, like were they pro hosting refugees in the country or not. We asked them a lot of questions about return, so like 10 questions about return, asking which factors are more important, like is integration important, is work important, is education important. So we had a lot of questions on return. We also, to investigate contact theory, we asked them about their contact levels with other migrants and refugees, and we investigated into the levels of social trusts of the participants. How did we recruit the participants in the first place? So we used social media, basically Meta. So these are some of our examples of the recruitment in Germany. So basically, participants received either Facebook or Instagram. They saw those ads, and then they clicked on the ads if they were interested in participating, and then they were transferred to an external page where they online survey where they conducted the survey. So their social media accounts were not connected whatsoever to their answers, and their answers remained anonymous and safely saved on our servers. I will move to presenting the results. Today, I will focus on my results on Germany so that we can give you a compact picture on one case, which is Germany in this case. And for some of the questions, I will present the other countries for comparison, but for the experiment, I will mainly present our German results. So as I mentioned, we did the experiments on Meta, so Facebook and Instagram, and this took place in Germany from the 29th of August until the 1st of October. The total of the clean observations, so the ones where they had full submissions and like within the age range that was allowed, was 1,008 submissions with a cost of 1,383, which means that it costed us per answer. So per click, it's lower, but it's not a full answer. So per answer, it costed us 1.3 euros. And then moving on to the social demographics, or to what extent the survey was representative of the German population. So this map here shows the distribution of the survey participants across Germany. And in comparison to the census, the latest census German data, it was almost a replica of the distribution across the different states in Germany. And then this here shows the age and gender distribution of our survey. And as you can see, we had an over-representation of older participants, as well as in some age categories of male participants. So all through the survey or the analysis, we were using age, gender, as well as also regional weights to account for this, the problem with the recruitment. This picture here shows the distribution of the marital status, and we found that the results were similar to the census. So more than 50% of our participants were married at the time of the survey conducts, and this is and 22% were single, and this is also similar to the German 2024 data census. We also asked them about their income level distribution. And as you can see here, this table shows the income. And we found that the majority of the participants were above the minimum income. So this survey, at the point of this survey, the minimum income in Germany was supposed to be 1,500, which suggested that some of the people were not actually working full-time at the time of the survey conduct. Also, we asked them about the political beliefs. And we gave them a spectrum, like on a spectrum from 1 to 10, where does your political belief lies? And we found that participants recorded more towards the right end of the spectrum, and we had to account for that in our analysis of the data. With that, I move to some of the results of the questions. As I said, some of the questions, I will present the results of the 5 countries so that you can get a feeling of where Germany do stand. So when asked people in general about their opinion of how does increasing the number of people of different nationality make living in your country, and we found that more than 60% of Germans said that it made it a lot worse. Not different from the other 5 EU countries. So the same, we found even higher rates in Netherlands and Sweden, with lower rates in Poland in comparison to the other country. When asked them about their level of satisfaction with the way the government is dealing with refugee and asylum processes, we did find very statistically significant and high rates in Germany. So around 82% of our participants were very unsatisfied with how the German government is dealing with the refugee and asylum process in comparison to lower percentages in the other countries. Then we asked them to order the policies that they thought would help in the reduction of the irregular migration in their countries, asked them which of those policies would they choose. And we found that the majority believed that increasing the deportation of irregular migrants is the best policy from their point of view to deal with the current situation in their countries. Also, we asked, as I mentioned, when it comes to attitudes towards return, we focused on those of their economic contribution. So it seems that in Germany, more than almost 50% agree or strongly agree that those who are working and contributing to the economy should not return to their countries of origin, even if they are not, their current status is not legalized. So they said that it should be legalized in that case. Also, those who are integrated in the country, again, in comparison to the other countries, Germany had higher rates of saying that those who are integrated should not be returned to their countries of origin. However, when asked if the return should be a loss, they still view that a return is not a loss to the country. So from those questions, we saw that integration is important, economic contribution is important, and finally, the return of asylum seeker will increase job opportunities in my country. In Germany, unlike the other 4 EU countries, they do not seem to think that the presence of those to be returned is a threat on the job market. So in other countries, they view them as a threat, like in Germany. So they actually combining this with the fact that they placed on the economic contribution. So they do think actually that they are an addition to the job market and they improve the economic considerations in the country. And those are the conditions under which they do not want those people to return. Now moving to the experiment that I presented, I'll present you just some insights from the experiment today. So as you remember, I presented to you the vignette and told you that people were asked which would they prefer to return. And we varied the characteristics of the returnees. So we changed their country of origin, their gender, their education, and their language skills. So when comparing the avatars from Syria and from Ukraine, there was no statistical difference. So participants did not care about the nationality of the returnee when they made their decision. However, they did care about the gender. So as you can see, the picture on the right, we were comparing females to males, and we found that the participants had stronger negative feelings toward males and stronger support to the return of males in comparison to females, which goes in line with previous studies that has been done on the topic. Now moving to the job and the language. So when we compared those with high skills, meaning that they were with bachelor degrees and worked as engineers, with those with low skills, we found again a statistical significance. So participants were more pro the return of the participants with low skills and low educational skills. And finally, the language, we found that in Germany, language mattered actually the most. So this was the strongest statistical difference. Those that spoke fluent German, participants were more anti-return of them than those that were still learning German. Finally, we conducted, those are the results of a preliminary, so ordinal logistic regression. And as you can see, what really stood out, the two variables that really stood out significantly in the regression was the skills and the language. So those that spoke fluent language, and again, were not were not working in jobs that the Germans viewed as needed in the job market, were to be returned from the point of view of the participants. Also, something interesting that we found, that a specific group, that they received higher return decisions, which were Ukrainian males, even if they spoke the language fluently, and even if they were working high-skilled jobs, still German participants were pro the return of Ukrainian males, and this goes in line with some of the literature that was specifically focusing on the view of some of the host countries that males should actually return to the country if there is a war and help in defending the country and not be hosted as refugees, unlike women and children. And with that, I conclude my presentation. So today I presented to you our GAPS project, and this work package specifically focusing on public attitudes towards return. I presented to you our survey and the components of the survey with the vignette experiment and some of the main results in our survey. And if you're interested more, so our report with the final results of the survey will be published soon, so you can get access to that and read everything in detail. And today I focused only on the German public beliefs, and we found that Germans place a lot of importance on the contribution to the economy, the importance of integration, and they do not view the people in the country as a threat to the job market. And there's also the experiment to actually support that, so the job market skills matters the most, as well as the language spoken, the language of the country speaking. And with that, I end my presentation. So thank you for listening, and I will be happy to get any questions from your side. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing this very interesting results. Let's move on to the other presentation, and at the end we will have the discussion part. So Francesco, if you can share your screen.
Yes. Okay, can you see it?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, so hi everyone, good afternoon. I'm Francesco Renzini, coming from the University of Milan and the PA lab within the University of Milan, and I'm postdoc working in the FAIR consortium. And in particular, this work packages of the FAIR consortium was dedicated at understanding the voters' support, say, or preferences on return and different alternatives to return. In particular, the objective was to conduct a large-scale online survey with different experimental design in order to assess this public support, or if you wish, preferences for various policies related to irregular migration, particularly also by focusing on the different categories of migrants who should be the recipients of these policies across 13 EU plus countries. Clearly, as also the GAPS project showed, the idea was also to disaggregate such preferences by relevant socio-demographic, attitudinal, and ideological characteristic of respondents. The policies that we investigated were return approaches, that is, how should respondent country enforce return? Second, regularization, that is, which features of regularization packages are supported, and in particular among these, one of the most interesting aspects was which migrants should be regularized, which category of irregular migrants should be regularized. and what should be done in case if regularization is not possible. And here we had two different cases, one for migrants that receive a return order and still can technically be returned to their country of origin or third countries, and two migrants that receive the return order but are non-returnable. So I give you a preview of the preliminary results, right? So we see that we witness substantial heterogeneity in public preferences towards all of these different type of policies, but we find a common theme that the biggest variation is explained by ideological, I mean political, ideological and attitudinal lines. And surprisingly, variation by key socio-demographic characteristics of respondents, such as gender, age, and even education, is considerably lower and lacks consistent pattern. By entering more in details in these findings, I would say that we are witnessing with this survey that politically and ideologically moderate respondents are much more similar in their preference towards each of these policy packages to right-wing individuals at the extreme of the distribution than to left-wing individuals. So we started to see a general polarization clearly between left and right-wing individuals, but with the center, that is the majority of our respondents, clearly moving increasingly towards the right-wing ideological spectrum or conservatives and anti-migration attitudes in general. Surprisingly, as I was mentioning, educational attainment shows limited explanatory power in the sense that the preferences of university-educated individuals are broadly similar to those of non-graduates, even to those who do not have a high school degree. And other particular differences by gender and age are basically not there. There is some sort of country-level variation with Central European countries, in particular Germany, Austria, and France, showing a preference towards more muscular policies in a way, whereas Southern European countries lean towards more tolerant policies. I mean, this is just a preview of the preliminary results. Now let me enter into them. Before doing so, a brief introduction on the sample. This was done in February, March 2025 with a survey company. These are the 13 EU plus countries, considering also Switzerland and the UK that we included in the sample. The total sample size was 16,301 respondents with more than 1,250 per country. Each sample is representative in terms of age, gender, and region of residence within a country by design, but also it represents the country distribution also of other variables that weren't used in the stratification phase. So the first question that we can answer is, which return enforcement should your own country, okay, that we asked to respondents, follow? We informed respondents about who are irregular migrants, what is the European and the UK regulation about what should be done with irregular migrants. We told them that there are two main broad, big approaches to achieve return, and those are assisted voluntary return, in which we emphasize the fact that migrants had to, it was a sort of a deal, a negotiation with the state authorities, and forced return, which was more a muscular response by the state. Here you see that in the whole sample, the majority of individuals favored forced over assisted voluntary return. In fact, here the probability, here I'm sure the probability of selecting assisted voluntary return over forced return, which is about 44% in the whole sample. Clearly, disaggregating this by some respondents' characteristics makes all these findings much more interesting. For instance, here you see the predicted probability of favoring assisted over forced return from a logistic regression model controlling for different socio-demographic characteristics and country of residence of respondents, disaggregated by an ideology index that we built. Basically, this ideology index considers questions related to the political ideology so both left-right orientation and progressive conservative, and also towards general attitudes towards migrant in general, such that individuals with negative scores are left-wing individuals with very positive attitudes towards irregular migrants. Individuals with very positive score are very right-wing individuals, conservatives with very negative attitudes towards migrants, and in between we have moderates, both simultaneously on the political dimension and on the attitudinal towards migrant dimension. You can clearly see that the right-wing individuals clearly favor forced over assisted voluntary return. The opposite is true for the left-wing individuals with positive attitudes towards migrants. But the interesting thing is that the moderates, which are, by the way, clearly the most frequent group that we have in our sample, are much more similar to the right-wing individuals than to the left-wing ones. In fact, the predicted probability of choosing assisted over forced return is about 30%. Here I show the same plot, but now also by disaggregating by the educational attainment of respondents. And here you see that basically the same patterns apply also for university degree graduates. Clearly, there are differences in the sense that university degree graduates tend to favor more, on average, assisted voluntary return than those with at most an upper secondary education or at most a lower secondary education. But if you look at moderates here at 0 with a university degree, they do to favor a lot forced return over assisted voluntary return. If we disaggregate by country, well, here it is a bit a mess, but the interesting thing is that even here moderates of in any country tend to be much more similar to the right-wing individuals, and in particular the Germans ones, moderate, are much more similar to their own right-wing citizens than the Greek one that are the most relatively dissimilar. Coming to regularization policies, what we did is that we asked respondents to undercome a regularization, a conjoint experiment in which we showed 8 pairs of proposals for regularizing migrants. This proposal changed at 6 different dimensions that we extracted from typical laws that have been enacted in Europe. And we asked them the following question: suppose that only these 2 proposals are available and you must choose one, which one would you choose? Clearly. And we randomly varied the composition of these policy proposals for 8 different pairs, each for each respondent. Here are the results. For instance, with respect to type here, it means that we see that they're more or less indifferent. I mean, there is slight preference towards regularization policies that are codified by a law in a permanent mechanism rather than ad hoc policies. With respect to cost, which basically meant who should pay for the whole regularization policy, we see that the national government is clearly the least favored option, and respondents are indifferent between using European funds or letting the migrants to pay for their own regularization. Then, which category of migrants should be regularized? I guess this is the most interesting dimension that we are gonna explore in the next few slides. In general, we see that the most disliked policy is regularizing migrants for work-related motives, and the most liked policy is regularizing migrants who have a high level of sociocultural integration, while in between we have more humanitarian reasons like regularizing non-returnable migrants or migrants that have a serious health condition or cannot be returned because they are victim of exploitation, for instance. With respect to more logistics, technical aspects of the permits that should be granted through regularization, we see clearly that that there is a temporal dimension where the shorter term the permit, the more likely it is to be supported. For instance, 1-year permits are vastly more supported than permanent permits, and then you see the different shades depending on the time span. In general, the regularization should be withdrawn if individuals commit a crime or if they become returnable, and respondents want migrants to have a hard time in a way to access this regularization, in the sense they want them to undergo an interview with immigration officials in order to obtain this regularization rather than just send a simple application. By trying to see how this dimension, that is, who should be regularized, varied across the political and ideological spectrum, we can see again here the same pattern, that is, moderates and right-wing individuals are very similar in the sense they tend to prefer to regularize migrants based on sociocultural integration, and they tend to dislike regularizing migrants based on humanitarian concerns, while if you see left-wing individuals do tend to prefer regularizing migrants based on humanitarian concern, and the fact that migrants are not returnable is an important issue for them. There is a surprising consistency and agreement in that every individual, regardless of the political ideological orientation, doesn't like work-related regularization, clearly relatively to these other possible type of regularization policies. Interestingly, these preferences do not change again by the educational attainment, where regularization based on sociocultural integration is the most favored and the least favored is work-related regularization, also for university graduates. And with respect to country level differences, we see, we don't see clear patterns, but we see here that Germany, France, and Austria, again, are very similar among each other, which tend to put a great emphasis on sociocultural integration, while countries such as Italy, Greece, Spain, and also the Netherlands do tend to emphasize also humanitarian-based concerns. Coming also to the other aspects that we gather our preferences on, we made clear to respondents that all migrants could or will be regularized, and therefore we asked, after issuing a return order, how should country manage irregular migrants while they await their return? And we basically provided 5 different policy options in a random order and asked respondents to rank them. And here you see the results from disaggregated by, again, ideological orientation of respondents. Here the policies should be: you do nothing, you place them in detention centers, you gave them some basic services, case management, or obligation to report to authorities and the police while they await their own return. And you can clearly see that as we move from the left to the right, detention starts to be one of the most favorite options, because this is an estimated popularity scale, and also obligation to report, so being in contact with the authorities and the police is one of the most favorite options. Clearly, this is the opposite for left-wing individuals, where giving basic services and case management are the most favorite ones. Again, here you see that the transition starts to happen early. Already moderates here, for instance, are preferring obligation to report, and they are indifferent between basic services and detention. Then, how countries should manage irregular migrants that cannot be reasonably returned. Here we had 3 options, that is, do nothing, give them a renewable permit, or offer them shelter. And here we see the same patterns in which giving a renewable permit is not liked by right-wing individuals, but also by moderates, and is the most liked option among left-wing individuals with positive attitudes. So here again, we see the same thing by country that we saw before. In this sense, Germany, Austria do not like giving renewable permits, the same as France, where Italy, Spain, and to some extent Greece tends to be more towards this option. So to conclude, this is just a sneak peek of all the results that we have, but in general, political ideology is the strongest driver of variation in public preferences for irregular migration policies. And interestingly, the moderates are increasingly aligning with right-leaning preferences on irregular migration, showing support for more muscular and enforcement-oriented approaches. Also, surprisingly, educational attainment has limited explanatory power, in the sense that university graduates are very similar to non-graduates with respect to their preferences, and we see the emergence of regional differences, where Southern European countries tend to express preference towards more tolerant policies, say, while Central European countries, in particular Germany, are shifting towards more restrictive, control-oriented approaches. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Francesco, so much for sharing this very interesting results. We will discuss more later. Ignacio, if you want to share your screen, we will continue now with the project more.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Do you see my screen?
It's perfect.
Perfect. Thank you. So good afternoon to everyone. Thanks for the two previous presentations. Today, I'll be presenting the work we've been conducting here at the Compass in Oxford with Carlos Vargas Silva, where we've been looking at service as the unit of analysis instead of individuals. And the exercise that we did here was to try to map the data availability and data accessibility of service regarding public opinion. So to contextualize a bit this in terms of the MORE project, as you may know, the MORE project has a critical examination of return and readmission policies in terms that it focuses on the different alternatives to enforcement of return, and in particular to those cases of third country nationals that have been classified as non-removable or non-deportable. And some of the key findings so far from some of the work packages in MORE is that there is quite an important level of heterogeneity in terms of national country responses to third country nationals in this situation, but also there is interesting findings in terms of how the idea of effectiveness of return and readmission policies is somehow restricted in terms that it has been focused mostly on the enforcement of return in terms of return rates, and leaving on a secondary role or plane the protection of migrants in terms of their rights. And in this sense, what we tried to do in MORE was to apply this framework to the study of public opinion service, considering that at the point when the project started, data on public opinion service was relatively scarce, inconsistent in terms of the type of questions that were done, and of course, that we've seen, especially from today as well, there is more data nowadays, but at the moment the situation was quite different. I'll be presenting some results in terms of data availability, in terms of coverage by time, but also in terms of geographic coverage, and what type of studies create these data, such as whether these are article-based or whether they are developed by institutions or specific companies that work on developing public opinion service. Another focus that we are interested in is looking at the thematic gaps. And basically we will be using the framework that I'm showing here in terms of, in a more basic way, liberal democratic states have basically three responses to regular migration, as we've seen from specifically the previous presentation. States can deport or can attempt to deport irregular migrants. They can ignore irregular migrants, and of course this has important consequences for leaving them in this sort of limbo, right? And another alternative is, or another option in this case, is to provide an inclusive approach. And this is what some of the alternatives that the MORE project has been studying. So with this framework of these three possibilities, return and readmission policies include measures such as the readmission agreements that with third countries that are needed to deport irregular migrants. Then other possible measures is the detention of irregular migrants, and thirdly is the enforcement of return itself, that it can be voluntary or forced. The other side of the coin here, in terms of alternatives, is the inclusive measures from this framework that I just explained. Inclusive measures in this case includes regularization mechanisms and programs, and also alternatives to detention and case management on an individual basis, for instance. Thirdly, a third dimension that we consider in our analysis is how policies are framed. And this, in a way, is to draw from the what is the focus in terms of effectiveness? Is there a focus on the enforcement of return and understood as the return rates, or other elements or indicators such as sustainability understood specifically in terms of no risk of re-emigration once irregular migrants are being deported. Another important element that is considered in effectiveness when we consider in a more broad perspective is the respect and the protection of human rights along the process of deportation and detention. In this sense, our main objective, to come back to public service again, is to basically identify and systematize what data is out there, what services are out there, but also what data is accessible, public accessible. And secondly, and as I briefly mentioned in the beginning, what is the thematic coverage that the statements understood as the questions and the options that the questions ask in service consider. In terms of the scope, we looked at surveys that focused on policy preferences on return and readmission. So rather than focusing on surveys that are interested in views about migrants, we focused on policies that looked at policy preferences of return and readmission policies toward irregular migrants, right? So it's this subset of surveys. We had a geographic scope in terms of 27 European Union countries, plus Norway, UK, and Switzerland, and a 13 years period that span from 2013 to 2025. Geographic coverage, we included any survey that it was international, national, regional, local, and whether it was conducted face-to-face or online. The data collection was based on three strategies: one, desk research based on topic expertise, targeted online search with specific key terms, and also consultation with local experts. This was a public effort from the different MORE partners that it was later complemented here at Oxford for the countries that were not part of the MORE project. In terms of the analysis of the thematic coverage and the potential thematic gaps in service, we first we conducted a thematic coding based on the dimensions that I explained just a minute ago. In terms of, we have three dimensions: how surveys look at the enforcement of return, how do they look at alternatives, and how do they look and frame policy, return and readmission policy, sorry. And of course, we also provide a descriptive analysis in terms of the geographic coverage, the data availability, and time. Now I will be presenting briefly the results in terms of these two components. First, we find that there is few but increasing number of surveys examining policy preference towards return and readmission in Europe. In particular, we found 33 unique surveys, 12 of them with data available, and most of the surveys are from 2022. We have found that there is an increased number of surveys looking at return and readmission. We expect and we hope that the tendency, this trend continues. And Countries that lead the rank are Germany, Spain, and Sweden. And also, because several of these surveys are part of scientific articles that provide a comparative perspective, we also added this category of international surveys, as other studies have also done. When we look at, instead of unique surveys, when we look at geographic coverage in general, so for instance, these international surveys that I just mentioned, we find that there were 21 countries in the European Union that were covered. With these 21 countries can be classified in 3 groups, and there is another group in part of the European Union that did not have any survey on return and readmission. So, as I mentioned before, Germany, Spain, Italy, and Sweden will correspond to the group with high number of interviews. Then we have a medium and a low one with only 1 and 2, where we found the Netherlands, Norway, Slovenia, Switzerland, Cyprus, Czech Republic, Denmark, and Slovakia. We can do the same disaggregation in terms of whether the data is accessible or not. And here Germany is the country that is present in most of the surveys with accessible data, followed by Sweden, Spain, and Italy. And this can be a good source of information later for researchers that want to conduct comparative analysis. This picture will change later once we have published data or published publications from FAIR and GAPS. So looking forward to see that as well. This is the last slide for results, and it looks at the thematic gaps and the thematic coverage. Remember, we looked at these 3 main dimensions: enforcement of return, alternatives and ethical dilemmas, and policy framing and performance. Within these 3 dimensions, we found different subtopics or sub-themes that were focused on the enforcement of return. And within enforcement of return itself, it was conditional deportation, as we've seen also from the previous presentations. This means statements or questions that include an analysis of whether the respondent think return deportation should be conditional on integration, employment, or other grounds such as presence of family ties, or whether it's conducting studies in the destination country. Alternatives to return or ethical dilemmas was also present, but in a much minor scale. Of course, we expect this to change in the future, hopefully with a new projects analyzing return and readmission policies. And lastly, policies that asked about whether respondents were aware of the existence of deportation policies, or whether deportation should be used as a deterrent for future irregular migration, for instance, was less present in the survey statements. Just one technical note here. One survey can have more than one theme, so that's why we have more number of themes than surveys, of course. And when we look over time, this trend has been persisting since we've started the analysis. But yeah, let's see how the future looks in terms of new coverage of these themes. And in terms of concluding remarks, basically just 3 points to emphasize what we found. Firstly, we conclude that there is a panorama of data availability concern, in terms that there is a minority of data sets, and the data accessibility tends to be quite restricted, with the exception of scientific articles where in most of them, or in at least an important number of them, there is data publicly shared. It is important, in our view, to aim to have a coverage of statements that don't reproduce the biased or the restricted view of the return directive that is focused mostly on enforcement of return. And it would be interesting also that statements also consider what people think about the alternatives to the enforcement. And then we provide a reflection in the preliminary draft that we're writing for these results in terms of whether in the same question respondents should be asked what do they think about deportation, but also the alternatives to these deportations. And finally, also in relation to the second point, that it is important to have a more balanced survey agenda in terms of the different thematics covered. Well, thank you very much again. I'm looking forward for the discussion.
Thank you so much, Ignacio, for explaining the results of the MORE project. Also very interesting and kind of a different aspect to the survey. So that was really, good to hear. Of course, the results are not comforting, but also not very surprising, right? So I invite you now to have a discussion between the three projects. If you want, you can start, Ignacio, by giving us your reflections about the FAIR and GAPS results, and if you have any questions to raise them. And then after having like a 5-minute internal discussion, then we will open the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Sevda, and thank you all for your presentations as well. They were very enlightening, especially for us at MORE that we are looking at the service itself, right? So I would like to hear your thoughts on. Well, first I have a very concrete question. When is it foreseen to have some potentially not the data itself, but some working paper from this information? Because as you may know, along with this result that we just presented, we developed a catalog of surveys, and it will be very interesting to have your data in there as well for future comparative analysis. Another reflection that I had, I mean, you also covered in several of your results the alternatives, but I was wondering whether you could provide a reflection whether it is with FAIR and GAP and MORE and Prime and this and Prime project, for instance, where there is more attention to alternatives, or do you think that that before there was also an important view and consideration of alternatives to return in survey, in public opinion surveys? I think that will be all for the moment. I may have a couple of more comments.
Should we answer and then raise questions?
Yes, please, go on.
Well, on my side, thank you, Ignacio, for the brilliant work also to map in all the landscape, right? Coming on the very first technical question, I think we're gonna be able to have a working paper by mid-July and July, something like this. We are in the process of actually dissecting the results because we have really a lot of data and try to come up with a narrative in a way. But I mean, yes, there's going, I mean, it's coming soon, hopefully. And I do agree that all the surveys that I've seen also in the preparation of this design or to inform this design, to compare it, I've seen little focus on the alternatives as you have and your work has highlighted. Also to mention that in our work package, we also have this part about the survey, but also a more general mapping of the alternatives to return that has done a colleague, always from the University of Milan. And we do have seen very few works related on this, in particular in public surveys. And that was also one of the aim of FAIR, clearly.
Yeah, from my side, I can say that we're also, I'm still also working on the data. As you can imagine, a lot of data. Same case to FAIR, but we're hoping that we would have something, maximum by the end of August, hopefully. And I believe that in that case, we will share with all the consortiums in that case. With related to alternatives to return, I have to second what Francesco just said, that there are very scarce resources focusing on that. It's mostly from my side, and also our focus was on what people think in general about return, or like which returnees, if that's a term, are they okay in keeping in the country, but not with a focus much on what's the alternative, right? So I think this is also another gap that I am hoping our research together could be able to fill.
I have also very specific questions. Sorry, go ahead, Ignacio.
No, I was just gonna say, if Carlos wants to also comment on something, please, you're welcome, Carlos.
Yes. We will see him when he's opening his camera. Yeah, my question is very specific as well. So I can see that FAIR and GAPS, they did the similar surveys. Obviously, it's not the same, but in some of the countries that you did the survey corresponds. I was wondering if you worked together in that sense to do the surveys together, or yeah.
No, it's an easy answer. We didn't work together in developing the survey, but honestly, I'm happy to see that there is a lot of overlap in the sense that, I mean, the results are somewhat validated in a way.
Yeah.
For instance, for the German case, clearly we look at different aspects. The GAP project focus more on a question of, like, who should be returned, and why we focus more on a question on how should the whole policy package, say, of return and alternatives to return be managed by the policymakers, basically. So it's more the impressions or say the preferences, the supports to what policymakers should do in a way. But I'm happy to see that there is a lot of overlap and consistency among our results, also on the socio-demographics and attitudinal questions that are very similar to ours, and more or less we find the same distributions in Germany at least, but in general all over Europe.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Also, it was nice to see the GAPS research that was also looking at the then characteristics of the refugees and migrants, right? So kind of giving also a different aspect.
I mean, unfortunately, we didn't work together, but I'm also happy that the results are more or less like a thread extending to one another. And I think also once we have, like, as I said, I only presented today Germany, but the other countries are there. So once we have it written down, we can think of seeing where really we collapse together, specifically when it comes to the socio-demographics, like what are the main determinants, right, that affect the whom should stay, in a way, and like also the other side of the coin, which is like which alternatives are to those who are not to stay. So I think in a way, until now, what I noticed is that there are some similarities. So it's comforting to know that the results are not different. And maybe with more future results, we can see more similarities and possibilities to combine work together at some point.
Absolutely.
Okay, we have some questions on the chat as well. Carlos, please feel free to jump in whenever you want. So this question is for FAIR. I'm surprised, I'm reading the question. I'm surprised with the results on preferences on regularization, when work-related paths were the least preferred. This was also surprising to me. This don't seem to align with other tendencies on the issue. So how do you read that results? Is it consequence of having to rank on different grounds? And I'm going to add something that also might explain, like, how did you frame this question per se? And then the second question was, on the general framing, why choose alternatives to regularization instead of alternatives to return?
Thank you for the questions. First, the results are not claiming in general that work-related regularization are not liked is that are relatively compared to all the other possible categories of irregular migrants that have been addressed by different regularization policies, those that are regularized for work-related reasons are relatively less favored. So it's not an absolute statement, say, of non-support, right? But it's a relative statement in the sense, if I have, say, a gun to my head and I have to choose, I'd rather prefer in general have to regularize someone that is very well integrated rather than he's working in the economy. Okay, this was the to answer also to the question. Related to the why we choose alternatives to regularization. Well, our idea, okay, there was a lot of discussion internally about how to frame this, also because all the process of, I mean, the return, the management of the return and alternatives regularization is very messy legally and politically across Europe, as you also mentioned previously. The idea was to try to map the whole life cycle, say, the legal life cycle, starting from return, that is how to enforce return, then the main alternative to return, that is regularization, and then letting knowing individuals that regularization is not always possible. And here you have a whole portfolio of different things that states can do. And this depends very much on whether the migrant is or is not returnable. And so we try to explain very simply all of these things. And we try to get all of these different nuances and paths. But the idea was to have this general life cycle from receiving a return decision, being an irregular migrant, to actually being returned through all the possible different parallel histories that someone can experience through regularization or other options.
Thank you so much. There is a question also for gaps. Carlos, yeah, please.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt the questions that we have there, but just I had a question, I think, for the three presenters. And I think when we started working on this topic and more, the idea was that we have a lot of evidence on attitudes towards migration in general, including experiments, as some of you are doing, and that potentially looking at return will give a different perspective, that, it's just not attitudes towards migration, it's something more particular, right, about who you return or not. However, looking at the results from the two papers, it seems that the results that we have are very similar to the results from the attitudes towards migration. So the preference towards higher skilled, migrants versus lower skilled migrants, the more positive attitudes of people, from the left or people with higher levels of education towards migration. So I guess my question for the three presenters is there any points on focusing on return, or do we have enough just with attitudes towards migration and that literature that already exists? So to what point, what are we adding in this regard if the results tend to be similar to what we have already?
Difficult question from Carlos. Anyone wants to go?
If I could, sorry, please go ahead.
No, okay. Just very briefly, well, the first thing that for instance, FAIR can add is having data about the preferences towards the management of irregular migration, which we didn't have, basically, about which type of regularization are favored or not and what to do in different cases. But also there is somewhat surprising result in that. I mean, it's not surprising per se, okay, but it is well documented here, is that this shift in the sense that moderates are much more like to right wingers in a way than the opposite. I mean, than the left wings, and also that these preferences do not tend to vary much by educational attainment of respondents. I mean, it's just say a political / ideological / attitudinal response rather than having a degree that helps me somewhat have different nuances perspective on the issue.
I mean, from the gap side, I do agree with you that we actually do find results, the support that the determinants towards return are similar towards the determinants towards migration. And I don't think that we do not add something, rather on the contrary, I think this actually adds something, that the fact that people do not really or differentiate much between labels. When you're seeking public attitudes, there's not much a difference between labels like we on the policy or even the academic level do. At the end of the day, on the public level, it's comes to the simple question of whether the person, regardless of what this person is labeled, adds to the economy / country / whole picture or does not. So I think this actually is a contribution in itself that we come up with, that at the end of the day, the policies, instead of focusing on, or that would be my intake, instead of focusing on what are the, or investing much in what are the alternatives to return, it should be an investment more on how to keep those returnees in the country under the conditions that would be supported much by the public. So more investments in their skills, in their languages, in their integration into the country, rather than investing that much in their return. That would be my add to that.
I also will have a reflection on that. I think also from answering from the meta perspective, I will say that we now know that they are similar, right? So before we didn't know, and because now we know, that's a result that can help policymakers create kind of more informed policy. And if the correlation is quite high, then it might not need it so much more information about each of the specific topics, right? Because if we already know that there's correlation with attitudes towards migration in general, then it may suffice for some policy design, for instance.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. That's brought me actually, Lamis, when you were mentioning I think it was in your presentation that people were less likely to prefer to return someone that has the highest level of integration, right? What do you mean, or what that this survey meant by integration? Is it the language, or was there other criteria?
So the survey basically distinguished between language on its own and the word integration as a term. So it didn't identify that speaking the language is part of integration. It's instead just used integration. That was one distinctive thing, and then speaking the language as another thing.
Okay. And in the German policy context, what does integration would mean?
I think within the context, it means just beyond speaking the language. I think it means like speaking the language, having a steady job, not relying on support from the government. So I think it has, within the German context, this is what the word integration would mean, that this individual is self-sufficient within the country without any support from the government, mostly.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I will read the other questions if there's no more comments on that. So this question was also for gaps. Were there any follow-up questions after the dissatisfaction with asylum system to know the why? You mentioned that the majority of the people were dissatisfied, yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately, we did not investigate to the why. Like initially, we did not expect very high unsatisfaction levels, to be honest. So there was no follow-up question to why people were not really satisfied with government performance. So yeah.
Okay. Another question for Fair. Right. I'm reflecting on the results of the recent referendum in Italy. Although the overall turnout was below the 50% required for the referendum to be valid, majority of those who did vote supported strengthening labor rights. However, the proposal to ease the requirement for obtaining Italian citizenship received significantly less support. Only 65% voted in favor. This suggests that many voters who hold progressive or left-wing quote-unquote views on labor issues may still oppose extending rights to people of foreign origin. How do you interpret this with the outcomes of your study? For you, Francesco.
Well, thank you so much for this question. It's something that I noticed as well. To give very briefly some context to those of you who are not Italians, this weekend there was 5 referendums in Italy, 4 about labor rights and 1 about halving the requirement, the time requirement to become Italian citizen for foreign individuals who hold clearly some permits to work and live there. And the turnout was very low, was about 30%, and was the referendums were sponsored and proposed by left-wing parties and labor unions. And therefore, political commenters say that only left-wingers went to vote in a way. And among the 5 referendums, as the question was saying, there was 85% in favor for the labor rights, and only 65% in favor for reducing the requirements for the Italian citizenship. And since these were likely to be progressive left-wing voters of these parties, I guess that this, in a way, would validate what we found here, that even individuals who are in the left wing, say political sphere, do tend to have some nuances takes, say, on migration-related issues that now is in a way, says more as the fair results shows, is more or less drifting towards the right, also for voters who are not on the right itself. That's how I interpret it. Also, these results. But very thank you for noticing it.
Thank you so much for the explanation. We have last 2 questions. I'm going to read them both, and then you guys can answer. So one is about the methodology, actually. They're asking, I have a question for more and fair. Do you think qualitative methods can be used to probe into this a bit more? Why people prefer or not prefer returns, forced returns, voluntary returns? And then the last question is, have any of you studied the extent to which policy preferences are contingent versus fundamental? For example, fundamental opposition to regularization, regardless of any policy design.
Well, I can start with the first. Surely, I absolutely believe the qualitative methods would enrich this type of research, because you can do, there is the typical trade-off, right? You cannot enter too much into the depth of the issue with surveys, right? Because you target to have very large numbers. And so dedicated qualitative methods can be helpful, right? For instance, maybe to target some specific individuals that the survey itself flagged as interesting, like those moderates, right? In order to see, for instance, in the fair case, if they are really anti-migrant, say they have these anti-migration attitudes. And the other question, I don't remember. Sorry, Sevda, what was?
If any of you have studied the extent to which policy preferences are contingent versus fundamental. For example,
No,
I am opposed to,
Yeah, we did not study that in our case, but this is a nice point, clearly, yeah.
And to briefly add, I agree completely with Francesco. So qualitative methods for public opinion on or policy preference on return and readmission. Yeah, I think on a first stage it will be more exploratory, and from those findings, quantitative approaches draw upon. And then on a complementary stage, once we have those results, then we could use qualitative methods to try to understand these global scale results.
exactly.
Completely agree.
Yeah. And on the other hand, at least for the more projects, we have a really big ethnographic part of our research as well, where we interview the implementing agents that are involved in the detention deportation processes, but also the alternatives, the migrant themselves, the frontline workers, and so on. So this will be hopefully complementary to the results of the surveys. Okay, I have a final question to kind of wrap up the session, and I know that Lamis has touched upon this a little bit, But this question is for all the projects. What do you think the policy implications of your research, considering, as Ignacio also mentioned at the end of his presentation, considering the proposed joint return EU directive, right? What do you think will be, the policy implications of these findings in terms of the current political context at the national and EU level?
I can start briefly. Thanks for the question. I think I also had that question for the presenters, for the two for Francesco and Lamis. So I think there is one risk, right, that that the results may be interpreted as a legitimation, right, of certain policies, right. So as we know, there is an important connection between understanding the public and how public opinion may be shaping as well some policy design. So I don't know, I think rather than an answer, I have a question or a reflection in terms of how aligned do we think we are, these results that we are starting to get about what the public think about return and readmission with the current policy making in the European Union. And we know that this relationship, as this alignment has changed over time, right? So I don't know. I wouldn't know the answer. I will just point to that reflection.
Thank you, Ignacio.
I mean,
sorry. Please.
Okay, thanks. I mean, I would agree in this part that it's very sensitive, right? To which direction the policy recommendation would go, because we wouldn't want to come up with a policy that says that a return is a favored policy, actually, at the end of the day. So as I already mentioned, I would second it again that so from our results, basically the recommendations would be more investments into the two main things that would improve the conditions of the individuals in the country. So mainly their educational and job market skills, as well as their language skills. And also another policy recommendation would be to try to change the media narrative based on that. So instead also to focus on the scenarios where the return might not be the best policy, or like on the other alternatives to return, and increase the media focus on those narratives rather than the other narratives. So more or less to make the alternatives to return more favorable to return in the eyes of the public. So that would be my take on that.
Thank you so much.
Very briefly on my side, I do tend to agree with Ignacio that I mean that I don't have an answer, also because I still have to process a lot of information in a way. But yeah, I see the nuances of having the risk of seeing, well, this is a legitimation of what we already thought. I mean, a back thought of the policymakers could think about this for the recent shift in the European governance. But to be honest, I don't know what to say right now. Right, I have to think honestly about it. I just dedicated to this analyze. These are the data. This is what we found, and it's it. I'm sorry about this, but I still have to to process the implication of all of this.
Well, that's great. These presentations are for that, right? To discuss and to raise some questions. We also had two additional questions. One is really related to what we just discussed now. So maybe just to take it home with us is, why is there such a strong preference for forced return? What are the mechanisms behind this? Could it be that the public prefers this option because of the particular framing of return in media and policy debates, or vice versa, or any other explanations? So that's the question. And then there's one more, and this is the last one, I think. Considering you studied different countries, I am curious if you know if there's any link between policy preferences and the number of irregular migrants, as well as effectiveness of quote-unquote return policies. In the GAPS presentation, I thought I saw that Polish respondents were less critical about their own government policies, and this might have something to do with the fact that there's simply less irregular migration.
Well, I can. Oh, sorry.
Okay, so for the first question, yeah, I think the question seconds what I said about how return is framed in the media and the political debates. So I think that, of course, this has an effect on public preferences, and maybe just changing the narrative would make a lot of difference. And as for the second question, from our data, this does not seem to be the case. Because Germany had the highest number, and still the views do not like there is no correlation directly between the number and the attitudes. Plus, to the point that there seems to be an over exaggeration. So, like in our data, we already asked participants, what do you think the number of irregular migrants in your country is? And there is always an overestimation in comparison to the actual numbers in all the 5 EU countries. So it seems that so there's no direct link between the policy or between the attitudes, and neither the estimated, like from the point of view of the participants, nor the actual number of regular migrants. And this is, I speak for my data, so.
Yeah, on my side as well. I mean, related to the number of irregular migrants, and to add to the picture, we also have some data about, I mean, we don't have data about overestimate, I mean, how many irregular migrants do you think you have in your own country, but which kind of nationalities are the most frequent of irregular migrants in your own country. And here we see a really high accuracy of respondents, in the sense that respondents in every country do spot the most frequent countries of origin of irregular migrants, and all the differences that we have in Europe. But in general, we don't see a consistent pattern among responses and the number of actual irregular migrants that are hosted within a country. And related to the first question about why such strong preference for forced return, okay, with our survey we can't answer, because it's just an exploration. I mean, we just get the data, so we don't have an actual explanation for this coming from our data. But in general, I do tend to agree, I mean, narratively, to what Lemmy said about the debate, the policy debate, yes, and the debate that spills over to the public, that it's much more about this than assisted voluntary returns. I mean, this is my 2 cents, but still, I guess I need to process all of this more deeply. So just providing this data from food for thought and something like this.
Thank you so much, Francesco. On that note, we can close the session here. I hope that this conversation between the 3 projects and also with the audience will continue. As you publish, I imagine, the working papers, we can follow all the projects on LinkedIn and other socials and on the website. Again, this video webinar will go on YouTube. So if you think some of your colleagues will be interested, please pass them on. And again, just an announcement that the next session is on the 26th or 26th of June, and it will be hosted by Prime Project. It will be about the rights of irregular migrants in Europe. I dropped the 2 links at the beginning of the Q&A. So thank you everyone for joining in, and yeah, hope to see you all soon.
Thank you so much for organizing it. Thank you.
Of course.
Bye-bye.